part two of talking about the works of George Orwell. We're dealing with his second book and his first novel, Burmese Days. As previously stated, Orwell had been a policeman in Burma for years in the 1920s. He became very disillusioned with the British Imperial Project, and I think his career also wasn't going very well. I haven't researched his whole life or anything, but in any case, he decided to come back. He threw up his position and decided to come back to Europe. Anti-imperialism seems to have been his first firm political stance that eventually led him into other areas that we'll talk about later. And his interest in the dynamics of domination, which seems to have sparked an interest in the lives of people who are dominated, which led him to some of his early works on poverty and homelessness in England and France. So this will be exciting because Burmese Days is the one major book by George Orwell that I have not read. I have it on my shelf, and I have been saving it, because after that, that's it. There's no more, and I don't like the feeling of that. I can reread, of course, but I kind of want to feel like I haven't done all of Orwell yet. Sort of like leaving open some place you've always wanted to go to as the place you decide you'll just never go to. I imagine it's quite good. I know a little about the book indirectly. I imagine it's something like E.M. Forster's earlier imperialist novel, Passage to India. Forster and Orwell share some similarities that maybe we'll talk about at some point. And the way in which, because they share similarities, the way in which they diverge winds up being really interesting. And Orwell makes reference to Forster a couple of times in his essays. So I haven't read Burmese Days, but I imagine it's a pretty good novel about imperial life in Burma, which Orwell knew well, and probably about the human cost of imperialism, the way that it divides people from each other and forces them to play roles. But what I have read, which were similarly inspired and is completely worth reading, is I have read Orwell's essay, Shooting an Elephant. This is one of the best short essays I've ever read. I don't think it's even 10 pages long. I'm sure it's free online. You should read it. It's an account of an incident which probably really took place, although or perhaps conflated or perhaps fictionalized a little bit. So Orwell is this policeman, and he's in this sort of market town in Burma, and news comes to him that an elephant has become quite aggressive and is like damaging property and threatening people and harming them, and someone needs to do something about it. So he sets off to discover what's going on with this situation, and he finds that it's true that there is this elephant which had been passive but which has now gone aggressive and has harmed some people, perhaps killed some. I do not recall the details. He thinks about it, and he comes to the scene where the elephant is. The elephant is at this moment sort of quiescent. It's not a super active threat, but it could turn so at any moment. And there's a lot of people around, and there's a lot of people paying attention to this situation. And he sends for an elephant gun. A normal gun is not strong enough, so he sends for one capable of piercing elephant hide. And the excitement when he does this, he just kind of wanted to have it as, he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. No one's trained him on how to deal with an aggressive elephant. But there's this expectation that he will do something. And he sends for it as sort of a precaution, just a half thought, like, oh, it'd be good to have an elephant gun on me right now. So he sends for an elephant gun. But as soon as he does, word spreads through the crowd, which is pretty sizable, that the British police officer is going to shoot the elephant. And that's very, dramatic. And as the word spread, he realizes that if he were to send for the gun, and the gun gets there, and then he doesn't do anything with it, he's going to look pretty stupid. It's just going to look bad. And on some level, he understands that his role as an agent of an imperial occupying power is not consonant with ever looking stupid or foolish or undecided. So when the gun gets there, he does shoot the elephant. I don't believe he kills it. He takes several shots at it. He's not a great shot or anything. He takes several shots at it and he wounds it, and he sees the elephant there wounded and dying, and he leaves. He doesn't want to witness its pain. He feels like he's done something wrong. He's worried, of course, about the value of the animal, and as it dies, he finds out later people basically just strip it to the bone. You know, they take every valuable element of the elephant, the ivory, the hair, I'm sure it's just stripped to the bone. They eat it or what have you, and he's reprimanded, called by some for destroying the elephant instead of doing something else. But in general, people seem to think that he made a good decision, and some people point out that the elephant was worth more than the lives of the people that the elephant had harmed or killed, which tells you something about the cheap value on human life that imperial powers put on their occupying peoples. And he thinks to himself, I wonder how they would react if they knew that the only reason I shot the elephant was to avoid looking foolish. That's the deep insight in this essay, is that dominating powers, imperial powers, can look cruel and they can look stupid, but they can't look foolish. That doesn't fit their position, and in order to avoid looking foolish, they would rather accept other deeper vices like cruelty, callousness, pursuing impossible policies, anything to avoid looking foolish. This is something that Orwell begins to know pretty well, and extends this insight when he goes back to Europe and starts to analyze the power structures in the societies back there. And it's one of the main reasons why having a dominating role, I don't say that every leadership role is a dominating role, although many of them are, but having a role in which you're expected to exercise authority, eventually unilaterally accept authority, even if it's informed by the institution that you lead. You don't get to look foolish. You don't get to have a sense of humor. Obviously, people with a sense of humor occupy these roles, but they don't have a sense of humor when they're fulfilling the role. Al Gore supposedly had a fantastic sense of humor. I always thought it was very funny when he was on Futurama. I read little bits of articles here and there which made it clear that he does have a great wit, but not when he was being Al Gore, vice president or senator, or not, very, very seldom. Not when he was occupying any position of authority or power. It's not consonant with that position. And so if you have a sense of humor and you want to use it, you compartmentalize it, of course, and you can do that. One story I read about someone with power who also made a great joke, was Alexander Haig, who had been Secretary of State and was Chief of Staff for Ronald Reagan. Now, Alexander Haig was normally considered very sort of robotic and supercilious, but I was reading an interview with someone who knew him well, a guy who wrote a book about him, actually, or co-authored, or ghost wrote a book, I forget. Anyway, he knew Haig very well, and he said Haig could be extremely funny. He said he was with Haig once, and someone saw that Haig was smoking a Cuban cigar, and of course, Cuba's under the trade embargo with the U.S., and they asked him jokingly how he could stand to support Castro like that. And Haig takes the cigar out and he looks at it and he says he prefers to think of it as burning his crops. In the context of the Cold War, that's a hilarious joke. And if he came up with that on the spur of the moment, that's brilliant. And if he had prepared for it, like if anyone ever called him out, that's even more brilliant. And I would like to know that particular Alexander Haig. But when he was being Secretary of State or whatever, he did not have a sense of humor. Part of the price of power seems to be that you have to address it directly. There are a lot of people out there who have no sense of humor, or at least none about anything they consider important. they have none of that ability to look at an issue from multiple perspectives. If it's important enough, they seem to think that having a sense of humor about it is just wrong. That you can't prize something and consider it precious and also tell jokes about it. And this leads to another essay by George Orwell, one that I love and have read many times, and it's called The Art of Donald McGill. This is years later into the, well, I don't know exactly when, but it's after Burmese Days, and Orwell is become more of a sort of general cultural literary critic at this time, and he writes an essay about seaside postcards. When you went to the seaside in Britain, and I think this tradition still stands, you used to send a postcard back home, first to let people know you were at the seaside. And also, these postcards were usually jokes. They would have like a cartoon of some kind on the front. And these are the kind that, like in the U.S., survives in the tradition of sort of the silly, half-naughty birthday card. I'm thinking of the kind that you pick up at like a Walgreens at the last minute. I associate them with places like Cracker Barrel and old-timey stores. But they'll say something like, for your 50th birthday, I got you something that you lost a long time ago. And then you'll turn and open the card and it'll say, a sex drive! Happy birthday! Waka waka waka. Right? They're really silly. They're barely jokes. They're just like these little nods towards cliche concerns. And the British seaside postcards, Donald McGill is one of the guys who creates them en masse. Orwell claims he's the best one. So Orwell gets a bunch of these, and he analyzes them as a social phenomenon, which is very entertaining. Normally someone... it's like when a really good writer takes a look at something so seemingly straightforward and shows you how there's deeper meaning behind it. It's a very, very good essay. And he shows how most of the humor in them draws from the drawings, and that there are certain just preset concepts that they draw on endlessly, just giving new and new variety to them, and how they constitute a sort of, and they've been pretty much the same for decades, and they constitute a sort of peek into the sort of undermined of British culture, a peek into sort of the perennial concerns of regular folks. I think he calls it like a sub-literature, under the flashy stuff, under the really complicated stuff. Here is some very simple little, one concept, one and you're done kind of jokes that tell us something about what people think. And in those postcards, he says predominantly they're sex jokes. This is 20s and 30s. There's still censorship codes governing even literature, like James Joyce's Ulysses had trouble getting into Britain because it had sex scenes. They're certainly governing film and radio, and so these postcards are sort of, I think he calls them, they're like an outlet. They're like letting off a little steam, so they let people make some naughty jokes that they might otherwise. One that he describes is where a judge is talking to a guy in the dock who's been accused of immoral behavior, and he's like, I want to know, did you or did you not sleep with this woman on the night of June the 22nd? And the guy goes, not a wink, my lord. Implying that he was with her, but they weren't asleep because they stayed up all night having sex. Did that need elucidation? I would hope not, but you never know. I don't want to miss. It's a funny joke. It's snappy, and there'll be jokes about butts and people, men having hallucinations because they're drunk. If anyone remembers the comic strip Andy Capp, I imagine Andy Capp having some outgrowth from these kinds of comic postcards, or the Lockhorns, the old ones, the ones that were like pre the changes in comedy that came after World War II, that were sort of softer and more genteel, even if at the time they might have seemed like they were bumping up against a societal norm. So Orwell then uses these to develop a thesis, which I think is true and great, which is that jokes and humor and comedy are always at least slightly subversive of something. Hello! That was a good salad. Okay, we're back. So yes, Orwell says jokes are subversive. They are these tiny little temporary wishes that the world was otherwise. In the case of the postcards that he's describing, they're mostly about unwrapping little social norms, about sex and obeying the law and following the moral code of his time. They give you just a little bit of release because he said there's two people inside you. There's the hero and there's the not the villain but the non-hero. There's the person who is like, oh yes, I will rise to the occasion. And he points out that people usually do rise to the occasion. Men work themselves in dangerous jobs. Women wear themselves out taking care of families. People are generally heroic given the right training and the right goals, something achievable. They will work themselves crazy for a cause. But inside of all of us, there is a little non-heroic voice that's like, man, it would be so great to just sleep in today. Why do I have to pay these debts just because I borrowed the money? Can't I cheat on my wife? Is that really such a wrong? Would she even mind? She'll never find out. And humor speaks for that side of ourselves. It makes it clear why powerful institutions like imperial police forces, for example, cannot afford to give that voice, to make that voice open. In private, deep in private, they can afford to let something like that out. They can afford to let out their doubts and their eye rolls and their sense of absurdity at what they're doing, but they can't do it in public. They can't do it openly. Just the way that Orwell couldn't call for a gun and then not shoot the elephant because he would look foolish. Empires can't openly say, oh, this is all bullshit. This is all stupid. You're not lesser people. We're not more suited to rule. We just want your stuff. They have to maintain the mask. They have to maintain the mask that they exercise their power for, honorable reasons, or at least for decent reasons, or at least for some reason. And if you're in a position of power, you have to sort of go along with that. You too have to step up to the mask. So in shooting an elephant, Orwell really brings out how power restricts those within it as well as those who are dominated by it. It restricts the lives of the dominators and the dominated. The dominator have to step up to the mask, and then the dominated, the mask being, whatever justifications for the exercise of power that are going at that particular moment, and the dominated have to accept it. This is similar to critiques made by many other people of dominating structures, that the aim of unraveling these structures, of weakening them and changing them, is not just to help the dominated. It's also to assist the dominators. It's to free their souls from the burdens of living up to the power. Gloria Steinem, in one of her famous articles on women's liberation, ends it by saying, of course, the ultimate goal will be that the liberation of women will be the liberation of men too. When women are liberated from second-class citizenship status, men will be liberated from having to enforce that second-class citizenship, and they will be able to take a more positive and healthy role in the world because they will now be among a community of equals rather than having to enforce this line. Other people have made similar remarks, not everyone, and some people find this line of thought too generous to the dominators, that they shouldn't, since they're benefiting from these systems, that we shouldn't feel sympathy for their problems. And I can totally see the sense of that sometimes, but I also note that there are these perennial critiques coming from people who note that domination is bad for the dominators. And although our sympathies and our goals lie with the dominated, in the long run it will be good for the dominators to be freed from the need to dominate. It will be good for, say, capitalist business pirates when the game that they play is improved and well regulated, so that they can live a more normal human life rather than devoting their souls to watching lines go up and numbers go bigger and smaller. It will be good for private uh, dominations statuses to fall when roles that are expected to exercise too much authority over people they should see as equals, when those roles fall away, like the role of a teacher or a parent, when they're more egalitarian, it will be good because they will find new ways to live out relationships with people that aren't based so much on controlling them and directing their actions. Now, people who have made the sacrifice and stepped up to the mask of domination find this at best perverse and undesirable, and at worst deeply scary. Because stepping up to the mask in the long run means giving your life over to it and your sense of self, and they have trouble imagining the world without um, that that element of domination, that element of their lives where they control others and where they in turn are controlled by others. Because if there's no good reason for them to control others, why are they letting themselves be controlled by their superiors? Why did they give themselves to it? Uh, it's similar to hazing rituals, which is something that Orwell also touches on in his thoughts on schooling. In hazing rituals, in an institution like a school or a sports team or a military vessel, the more experienced members of the institution get to treat the new entries into the institution badly. And the new entries put up with it. Every now and then someone's badly hurt and leaves, but generally they put up with it because the promise is that they in turn will get to hold the stick in a few years when they are the experienced ones. So dominated as freshmen and forced to, be beaten or play degrading games, when they become seniors, they in turn will dominate freshmen. And the suggestion that the whole thing should just stop, that it's stupid and unrewarding and foolish, is seen as sort of outside, beyond the pale. Because if it was stupid all along, then the people who they admired and looked up to in their time who did it, why did they do it? Why were they such fools? Why were they doing this dumb thing? We owe them some love, don't we? They're the ones who came before us. If we go back far enough, of course, these are our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors. Why do we think we know better than they do? Some people find that a really, really compelling argument for adherence to old codes of behavior, not all of which are destructive or domination. Some are just silly, but some of them are destructive and dominating. And they do not want to reach beyond it. This is one origin of William Gaddis's famous saying, which is, there's far more stupidity in the world than villainy. There's more just repetition without thought of things that are bad, of behavior and structures that are foolish, than there is people who are honestly doing this out of genuine enmity. If you give people the opportunity for enmity and say that it's fine and it's okay and you should take it, yeah, some people are going to take it, but a lot aren't, and that should tell us something too. Bad structures have to work hard to get people to participate in them because they're bad. They're not natural. It's weird to feel that way. It takes a lot of work and acculturation to get people to the point where they will naturally do horrible things. And they can be defeated often with just speaking out. The threat of just people pointing out that this is dumb. The threat of just people accepting, it's like the emperor's new clothes story. Just pointing out that the emperor has no clothes is often all it takes to shift the situation, which again is why we need abstract principles to appeal to get us beyond this danger that we are simply repeating mistakes from the past over and over and over and over and over. If we appeal to abstract principles, which on some level exist outside of time, then we can rise potentially. Not all abstract principles are good. I don't want to make it sound like this is a guaranteed thing. Appeal to abstract principles is often used to justify horrible, horrible, horrible deeds. But we at least have the move to abstraction to potentially weigh our real present costs against our real present choices and our present actions. What the sense of humor does, which is lacking among the dominators, and Orwell brings this out in others of his stuff that we'll talk about. What the sense of humor does is it allows us to experience a different reality at the same time as our current reality. It allows us to shift our perception and our focus and to show how someone else might feel about it. And that lets us test whether it's actually possible to act based on that assumption. If you make jokes about your leadership and you roll your eyes when people bring them up, you are implicitly saying that you can imagine a world in which things would be better, where that eye roll wouldn't happen when someone brings up, your current government or your current, pastor at your church. You're implicitly saying they are not meeting some mark that you have in your mind. And if they're not meeting the mark you have in your mind, even if you aren't doing anything about it, you're saying that another world is possible where they're better at their job, or where you have different leadership, or maybe completely different social structures. So keep making jokes. Make meaningful jokes about how the world should be, because it keeps your mind limber and able to assess and appreciate different realities. And as over time, as you're tasting your own sense of humor, you have to then start watching your own sense of humor for what it teaches you about what you think of the world. But the more you take your own sense of humor seriously and see if it actually integrates with what you want from the rest of the world, the more you might escape the danger of not knowing yourself, of not knowing why you're finding things funny or not funny, of not being in control of the process, of not learning to appreciate the other opportunities that are out there and which might lead you to become more the person you want to be. Well, that was a fun talk about a novel that I've never read, and one day will, perhaps. Now that I've talked about this, Burmese Days, maybe I'll bump it up the list and get it done soon. The next book that is part of this Orwell, talking about the work of Orwell, ramble, is Keep the Aspidistra Flying, which is his second novel, and there's a lot to say about that and how it connects with his next major work of nonfiction. So look forward to that.